Alright, so the first thing you want to do is get a Phillips head screwdriver, and there's 6 main screws on the bottom of the NES, and you got to unscrew those to take it apart. And I believe actually someone had taken apart this NES before and had lost one of the screws. So there was only 5 screws in the bottom of this NES shell. But that's okay. It still screws on fine. As you can see now, the shell is disassembled and we can take it apart. And what I like to do with all my loose screws is I like to tape them to a piece of paper in the areas that they are found on the device, and I like to draw like a little diagram. That way, you don't lose any screws, and it's very clear where each one goes back when you want to reassemble it. Alright, so since I'm actually disassembling this NES for a paint job, I'm gonna disassemble all these little parts that you wouldn't need to if you were just gonna do a 72 pin connector repair. So for this you need a very small flathead screwdriver to take off those little black design bits that are on the top of the NES shell. I'm probably using a little bit too big of a screwdriver here, but it works. But yeah, you want to use a really small flathead screwdriver, and there is like 4 or 5 tiny little screws on this side that you have to take off to get those black pieces off the top that you see. I'm just going to throw those tiny little screws in a Ziploc bag to make sure they don't get lost, and I'll throw the little black bits. They just pop off right now, and I'll throw those little pieces in the same Ziploc bag so I know where the screws go. And then if you want to take apart the cartridge slot door cover, there's 2 little screws and these little metal flaps that kind of hold the cartridge slot cover in place. And there's a very specific way that you have to put those back for the cartridge slot door cover to work properly. I'm going to be doing a reassembly video too once I paint the NES, so stay tuned for that later on the channel. There'll be a whole series on this little NES, taking it apart, painting it, reassembling it. They're all going to have their own separate videos, so watch out for that. The next thing we're doing is we're going to disassemble the RF shield. You have to take that off first in order to get the motherboard out. And again, I got my little diagram there where I'm going to tape all the screws to, so you know where each one goes. Oh, I had to do a little camera readjustment there. Sorry about that. Hope that's still easy to follow. We've almost got all the screws out now for the RF shield. If you want to know what that RF shield is for, it's for blocking radio frequencies, so you don't get that weird like static when you're on your cell phone or there's a radio on nearby your NES. Alright, so we got the final screw out of the NES RF shield. As you can see, we got our diagram there. It's like 6 screws, and then that thing just pops easily off. Alright, so the next thing you want to do is you want to disassemble the cartridge loader. There is 6 screws for that piece. At the back of the console, it's kind of weird. There's like a pair of silver screws, and depending on the console, sometimes these will be in different spots. So you just want to make sure you remember where the silver screws go back because they're a different size than the other screws. Alright, so we got all our screws out for the cartridge loader. I got them all nicely taped on my diagram there so you don't forget where they are. Remember those silver screws. And once you finish pulling out the rest of the motherboard, then you can slide that cartridge loader out. It's pretty simple, it just slides out. There's a couple more screws here around the power supply that you need to get out before you can pull the whole motherboard out. Great, now we got those screws out, and then yeah, the motherboard just pops out like that. Now to get the controller ports out, you gotta unscrew these 2 screws on the bottom as well. You can't get those controller ports disconnected from the shell without doing this part. So again, that's the Phillips head screwdriver. We're gonna put those in their own little Ziploc baggie along with the controller port cover. And now you still have to disconnect the controller port cables from the motherboard in order to fully disassemble this from the shell. It's really easy to do. They just slide out from the board there. As you can see, pretty simple. Yeah, you just pull out those cords and then you can slide out the controller ports from the shell. And then last but not least, there are a couple screws you gotta undo to get the power and reset buttons off of the bottom of the shell. And again, once you get those 2 screws out, it's the same process to remove that cord from the motherboard as well. Same thing you do with the controller ports. They usually just slide out pretty easy. Alright, so we got those final screws out of there. And once again, I got them all on my little trusty diagram there so I don't forget where they go. And again, like before, we're going to throw those pieces into a Ziploc bag so we know that they're all together and what they're for. It's nice to keep everything organized. This will make the reassembly process really easy. And then there's that kind of extension port on the bottom of the NES that doesn't really have any use. We're going to pop that out too. because again, we're going to be painting all this. So yeah, we're disassembling that too. And now we are done. We have fully disassembled the entire NES. It was pretty easy. You can do that in about half an hour.